Today we'll be talking about Sean Baker's 2017 film, The Florida Project. Some of you may recall Sean Baker actually visited Iona College last year. He's also the director of a film called Tangerine, which blew the doors off of the competition in Sundance a couple years before Florida Project. A story of two transgender prostitutes who were looking for their pimp on Christmas Eve that was shot entirely using iPhones. So I wanted to talk about the title of this film a bit, which is called The Florida Project. It can be a little confusing. The reference here is actually to housing projects, which is subsidized housing generally, which is meant to relocate the poor out of central slums, the idea being to redevelop the areas of the slums by forcing them out of the center of the city. This is a system that was operating very heavily in the United States in the middle of the 20th century, and we still see a lot of the after effects of that. Housing projects tended to be very closed communities with limited socioeconomic resources, so they tended to encourage crime and drugs, etc., etc. The Magic Castle Motel, where this film is set, is not subsidized housing. It isn't a government housing project, but it is a kind of ersatz housing project for the dispossessed, which is the direct result of Disney coming in and sort of building their own housing around Disney World Orlando, which is where, in the shadow of which this story is set. So the local economy basically collapsed. This motel, which was clearly built to bring in Disney World tourists, obviously isn't doing much of a trade, so it becomes a place for the poor to live, long-term housing, at least within the system that operates there. And I want to sort of make a theme alert here, because this does sort of indicate one of the things that the film is about, which is the relationship between poverty and America's fantasy of itself. Baker very deliberately chose this place, literally right in the shadow of Fantasyland, to consider questions of poverty and dispossession and social class, etc. The first discussion question for the Florida Project is, what is one unique feature of the Magic Castle Motel community? This is a film that's actually divided into three stories. There's Bobby's story. Bobby is the manager of the Magic Castle. He's a good guy who's trying to do right by his residents and keep things in order. That he's trying to keep, for example, criminal activity and drugs, and especially prostitution, out of the motel. One of the questions that arises watching the film is what motivates him? Where does his goodness, or where does his sense of order come from? The second story is Hallie. Hallie is the mom of the main character in the story, Mooney. She's single. She's quite arrogant and self-destructive. Her lifestyle is a threat to her well-being as well as her daughter's well-being. She refuses to listen to any sort of critique of the choices that she makes, particularly around the raising of her child, which raises the question, are we meant to sympathize with her? And if so, how? Where are the lines of sympathy there? And the third story, and really the big one, I suppose, in the film, is Mooney's story. Mooney is a very interesting character. She's an unapologetic troublemaker who basically is interested in having fun. But her story is constantly being being interrupted by the outside world, or the problems of the outside world. So her well-being, I guess, is under threat throughout the course of the film. Which leads us to the second discussion question. What one theme connects these three stories, and why? The inspiration for this movie, according to Sean Baker, was actually the Our Gang series, also known as The Little Rascals, which was a bunch of film serials made in the 20s and 30s and onward about a group of poor kids basically growing up in Depression America who would get into scrapes and, have schemes and generally try to entertain themselves in one way or another. And you can certainly see that in the story of Mooney. One particular way where that really resonates is the scale of her story. Mooney's world is very tightly circumscribed. It's defined primarily by the motel and a few other local places that the characters visit on a relatively regular basis. And even though it's only a mile away from Disney World, there's almost no direct reference to it in the movie, which begs the question, why? What is Baker after here? But again, back to that theme of the adult world or reality closing in on Mooney's illusion of life, on her fantasy that her life is like an episode of Little Rascals. And that scene where she's sitting in the bathtub and suddenly the John, basically her mom's customer, since her mom is prostituting herself at the time, presses up against the shower curtain, and suddenly the illusion, the separation, is no longer possible. And she's forced to deal with the fact that her world is bigger and messier than she imagines. The third discussion question is, though in many ways the movie is pretty grim, it also has a light tone, even a fun tone much of the time. Why do you think Baker does this? What is he after? Finally, a theme that we've been talking a lot about this semester is realism, and realism is a very important feature of this film, not only in the way the story is told, since it is something of a day in the life or a few days in the life of these characters. The events are resonant, but they're relatively small. There's nothing big that happens until you get to the end of the story. They're also very relatable. I'm assuming that no one in this class lives this way, semi-homelessly, but it's familiar enough. It's a story that we know, and it's certainly the kind of parameters of poverty and desperation and so on are very familiar to us, not just from other narrative, but in some cases we have had that experience or witnessed that experience in our own lives in different ways. And maybe most importantly is that it's an ambiguous story. And this particularly in relation to the characters. Baker clearly wants us to like Mooney and Hallie, and maybe even especially Bobby, but he doesn't try to make them noble. They're not perfect. They don't always make the right choices. Very often they're a victim of their own arrogance, not just circumstances, or the ways in which they behave make their lives worse rather than better. Which begs the question, why? Why doesn't Baker want us to see these characters as noble in poverty and suffering and so on? Why isn't this more of a story of Les Miserables and Jean Valjean, for example? And one of the answers to that question, I suppose, is that there is no simplicity in life or in people, that we do things for different reasons, that our lives and the events in them resolve in ways that are often messy and due to factors that are not under our control. And that is finally the sort of nut of what we refer to as realism. The real experience of life is much less congruous and much less consistent and contiguous than a typical sort of Hollywood fairy narrative, and certainly the narratives of a place like Disney World. Which leads us to the last discussion question. Do you think the film argues that Mooney is better off with her mother or in protective custody, and why do you think so?